Hey, and welcome back to your #1 source for cozy gaming and design content. I'm Nick, and today we're going to be taking a look at the RG35xxSP. So, let's get into it. Let's start with the specs and technical stuff. The Anbernic RG35xxSP is an extension to Anbernic's 35xx line of handhelds, the only real difference being the design, storage, and battery capacity. Every RG35xx console comes with the same 3.5-inch IPS screen with a resolution of 640 by 480, H700 quad-core processor, G31 dual-core GPU, 1GB LPDDR4 RAM, 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, vibration motor, and HDMI out. So, from a performance standpoint, they should all perform roughly the same. On the whole, though, this hardware is capable of playing everything up to the PS1, and I found that to be a pretty accurate claim. And my experience seems to fall in line with others. That is, this does great in more common Nintendo and Sega retro consoles. I haven't run into any issues other than what I think is just an ever so slight frame skip every now and then on Minish Cap, but I honestly don't even know if that's real or in my head, so I don't find it to really be an issue. I do, however, think that while this is great for those more common consoles, it's a bit lacking for more advanced ones. I would agree with Retro Game Core that N64, PSP, and Dreamcast are really more bonus systems, and they really shouldn't be the reason that you buy this handheld. Now, this comes stock with something called Portmaster, which allows you to play some modern PC games, and I was really excited to use this as my Stardew Valley machine of choice. But one, I found the process of getting that to work pretty frustrating. So if you're not into tinkering with stuff, I would say don't buy this for that reason. But also, I found the performance of Stardew to be underwhelming. Plus, it really isn't meant to be played with only a D-pad and face buttons, so unfortunately I'll have to wait for something else to make the dream of bringing that game around with me every day come true. But if you're only interested in the specs and numbers, you can find all of that elsewhere. And frankly, I'm not data-minded like that, so my focus and pointed interest with this little guy is... From an aesthetic standpoint, I much prefer the vertical DMG Game Boy style. I just think it looks better in general. Now, that's totally subjective, and I do have to say, I can find it a bit uncomfortable ergonomically for longer play sessions. Though I also don't generally have time to sit down and play retro games for more than a bit under an hour at a time anyway, so I've never personally found that to be too much of an issue. But because that is so subjective, I think that it's great that Anbernic offer their consoles in such a wide range of form factors. Given that the performance should all be roughly about the same, you can just pick up whichever form factor suits your aesthetic sensibilities and go with that. One of the reasons I chose to go with the SP is because while I love the DMG style and form factor, I don't love putting something like the Analog Pocket in my pocket or bag because the screen is just out there in the open, ready to be scratched and ruined. Now, sure, I could get a screen protector for every handheld that I want to take with me, but I don't think that's the perfect solution. Instead, I think the clamshell design of the SP is just that perfect solution. It allows you to have that vertical form factor while still solving the durability issue. Plus, from a design standpoint, it gives you a whole nother element to delight the user with. In the design world, we like to say that a great product should delight the user, and that can take any number of meanings. But regardless, the more interactions you're able to make delightful, the less you have to rely on one that is incredibly so. Clamshells exemplify this super well. With the classic DMG form factor, the delight is split between maybe 3 interactions: the visual interaction of the general form, and the physical interaction of slotting in a cartridge and pressing the buttons. With just these interactions, you need to either really like the formal elements or really like the tactile ones, or both, in order to love using the product. To their credit, I think Nintendo nailed both of those with the DMG, but the formal appeal is way more subjective, and a good number of people will just simply not like the way it looks. So, in order to get those people to enjoy using it, they would need to rely really heavily on the tactile elements in order to override that user's dislike of the general form factor. Adding a clamshell gives the designers another interaction to pull the user's attention. Now they aren't just thinking about the few tactile and formal elements we had before, but also the experience of using the clamshell, which will be their introduction to the console every time they use it. So that will shift their focus away from the formal element to instead focus on the tactile interaction of opening and closing it. It does a good job bookending the experience of using the console, and thanks to recency bias, the clamshell being the last thing you interact with means that it will stick in your mind the most. In these retro emulators, a lot of the time we lose the cartridge interaction. So for DMG-style handhelds, the designers are basically stuck making sure people love the way that the buttons feel and the way that it looks. But adding a well-designed clamshell to the formula lets us have something else to focus on as well. In effect, it replaces the cartridge interaction, and I think it's really effective in making these kinds of handhelds feel good to use outside of just the games. Now, it's important to be careful when making these kind of design decisions because it can very easily backfire on you if you're not able to make that high-quality hinge. Fortunately for Anbernic, this hinge is great. They somehow matched the hinge of the DS Lite really well. I don't know that I would say that it's identical, but if there are any differences, they're so insignificant I couldn't tell you what they are. The hinge locks at 2 points in its throw, with the first being where I would say most people are going to want to use it. But if you did want to use it in its second point, because you're a masochist or something, you totally can. Though it is a little less stable in this position, and knowing nothing about the decision-making behind this, I would say it's really probably just there so that you don't break the hinge if you accidentally overcrank it. Another thing that I love that they added is magnets to the top of the hinge. This ensures that not only will it always close with a satisfying thunk, but also it will stay closed even when the hinge inevitably succumbs to a bit of the daily wear and tear of being opened and closed repeatedly. However, a well-made hinge can only do so much. The rest of the hardware needs to be made well too, and fortunately in this case, it is. Overall, it feels really solid. The plastics feel pretty high quality, and the parting lines are clean and free of any sharp edges or lips. I do think that if I'm being nitpicky, the molds that they're using could use some improvement. Anywhere that there's text molded into the body, you can see the seams around where the plate for that locked into the mold. And while that's really not that big of a deal, I do think it would have been nice if they could either have done what the original SP did and indent these portions so the seam is much less noticeable, or at least done some kind of additional post-processing to the raw part to knock that down before painting. But that really is just nitpicking. Overall, it feels really well made. There isn't any creaking or cracking in the hinge or any other part of the body, and everything fits really well. I would have loved if they'd used standard Phillips head screws for the four holding the shell together instead of hex head, but I appreciate that they didn't hide anything under any feet or stickers or anything like that. I also think it's weighted really well. I think clamshell devices run the risk of feeling too bottom heavy, and while you obviously don't want them to feel top heavy, I also don't want the screen portion to feel non-existent. That would just make it feel cheap. But they avoid that pretty well by making sure that they didn't leave too much empty space in the lid. And that goes for the whole thing. It feels very dense, but not heavy, and that lends to a premium feel above what I would expect from something that costs like $80. I would actually say I think this feels more premium than the Analog Pocket, at least where the hardware is concerned. While I love my Pocket, and I always will, I do have some complaints about the overall build quality, and those complaints simply aren't present on this. One of the only real problems Retro Game Core found on the RG35xxSP was its somewhat controversially clicky face buttons. However, I simply didn't find this to be the case at all. Now, I'm not saying they were lying or anything like that. I simply don't think that the click of these buttons really bothers me personally. And I'll try to give you a sense of what they sound like here so you can decide for yourself. While I don't agree that the face buttons are too loud, I definitely agree that the menu buttons are. I don't really know why they decided to make these an entirely different click than that of the face buttons, but I would have appreciated if they were the same personally. But it's also really not a deal breaker for me. You only use the menu buttons every once in a while, and it really doesn't bother me in daily use. But yeah, none of these buttons are made for covert gameplay. And that goes for the shoulder buttons as well. They're essentially the same as the face buttons in their clickiness, and I actually found the ergonomics of these shoulder buttons to be better than what I had thought they would be. I didn't think I would like horizontally stacked buttons like this, but I think adding a marked height difference like they have increases the reachability significantly. And while it's still not perfect, I do think it's much better than if they had simply made them level with each other. Overall though, I'm super happy with the build quality of this device. It feels like it should cost more than it does, and while the stock firmware does leave something to be desired, that's totally fixable with the topic of our next section. Something that's really cool about these Linux and Android-based retro handhelds is the community that pops up around them to add a bit of polish to the software side, which is often missing when they come stock. I'm not a software guy, so I can't get into the real technical particulars of the custom firmware that's available for this. What I can comment on, though, is the experience of using them. I would say, for the vast majority of these handheld systems, just go in assuming you're going to replace the stock experience. It's very clear these companies are focused on the hardware, and the software team is likely totally separate from the hardware team. Generally speaking, the stock firmware on these are clunky and obtuse. I think the only exception that I've seen is the Analog Pocket. The operating system on there is so well integrated and designed that people are attempting to bring that experience to other handhelds with firmware that I've talked about before, MinUI. I think for the general user, this is the only firmware you should be looking into. It's simple to install. All you need to do is drag and drop a couple of files into the root of your device and turn it on. It runs over the stock firmware and basically just cleans everything up. However, it does get rid of a few features for the sake of simplicity. The list of emulators that it supports is very cut down compared to the stock firmware. So things like Portmaster won't be available, and if you're looking to use it as an MP3 player, that function will also be missing. But if you just want to play some handheld retro consoles, this firmware is perfect. It's sleek and simple, and has the distinction of being the only, at time of writing, custom firmware that supports the close to sleep feature on the SP. Others that I've tried personally include MuOS and Newly. In theory, any firmware that works on 35xx devices should work on this, but I can't speak to the reality of that, as any number of things can change in the background from SKU to SKU. I would say if you prefer a bit more of a tinkery experience, go with one of these two. They allow for a lot more than MinUI, but in my opinion, they're still on the clunky and bloated side compared to it. It really is about what you want to use this for. For me, MinUI is all I need, but that's just kind of part of the fun of these things. Tinkering and messing around and figuring out what you like best. And worst case scenario, you can always just revert back to the stock firmware. Anbernic makes the bare bones firmware available to download from their site, so I would say the only thing you need to remember to back up before any of this is the ROMs they rather dubiously include in their SD cards that they ship with their devices. Though I would recommend getting rid of those and just adding your own legally obtained ROMs. But that's enough software talk. Bringing it back around to the industrial design, something I like to look at in products that I buy is whether or not they hit their target. Now, determining that target can be a bit difficult, but with something like this, it's rather obvious. They're very clearly taking inspiration from the original Game Boy Advance SP, and I think in general, they succeed on all fronts. The original SP was a very unique device when it released, and it has an extremely strong visual identity. As is the case with almost all of Nintendo's hardware designs, it doesn't take more than a glance to know exactly what you're looking at. Even an untrained, uncaring eye could easily notice that this is something entirely different from all the other handhelds. Again, the clamshell brings a lot of value in that regard. It's still a very novel and unique design choice, and while we are seeing it a bit more in recent months, it still stands out among the crowd. And it's pulling double duty here as well. Not only is it a really interesting and unique design visually, but it's also an incredibly practical one. I picked up this Famicom-style SP from eBay so I'd have something to compare to for this video, and I was extremely surprised to see that the entire original screen from over 20 years ago is absolutely pristine. Now, there is a bit of a luck factor there because there's nothing special about the makeup of these screens that make them more durable than any other. But if you try and get a DMG Game Boy used, you'll be extremely hard-pressed to find one with a clean and totally scratch-free screen like this one, and I don't think it's controversial to attribute that to the clamshell design. Naturally, Anbernic's design will benefit from this choice as well. Now, if you compare the two side by side, the RG35xxSP is notably larger in all dimensions. But I don't think that takes away from the successfulness of their design. Adding a bit more to the X and Y axes allows them to give us a substantially larger screen, and having that screen be a modern LCD lets them make better use of the space at the bottom near the hinge because they don't need to use that for a front light like the original did. The Z dimension is a bit more controversial of a choice in my opinion, as it makes the whole device a bit less pocketable for anyone with smaller pockets. Like, I don't know, women? Though it's also a very small variation from the original dimension, so the difference isn't all that substantial. Obviously, they're basically just ripping one for one the entire design of the original, so it would be pretty hard to argue that they didn't succeed. But I think what makes the 35xxSP a notably successful design is the quality with which they did it. Honestly, if I didn't turn it on and you didn't tell me, I could easily be made to believe that this was made by Nintendo. You could probably tell me this was a Game Boy Super SP or something, and I would believe you. It's kind of crazy how far these handhelds have come since the days of the BitBoy. The quality of plastics is on par with what Nintendo were using back in the day, and they feel so similar to the hand that I wouldn't be surprised if they found the original recipe or something and just used that exactly. And the quality doesn't stop there. Things like the hinges and buttons feel amazing. Now, they're making some subjective choices with the clickiness of the buttons, but that seems to be consistent across all Anbernic devices, so you probably should just go into buying one of their handhelds knowing that the buttons will be on the clickier side. But I don't think I've seen a ready-to-use product that is this close to the quality and hand feel of retro Nintendo hardware until now. If you want the retro experience, but with some of the modern advantages like the ability to carry around all your ROMs with you or load your own custom firmware, I don't know that you can get much better than this. A flash cart comes close because that lets you load a bunch of ROMs onto a single cartridge and just use the old hardware. But it does seem like we've gotten to the point where I don't know that that would be my first recommendation. Now, the original hardware will always hold a special place in my heart because I just love seeing how things were back in the day, and there's just something inherently interesting about owning an object that multiple other people have loved and used endlessly. That's part of why I don't care so much about having absolutely pristine and unopened products, because to me, that's way less interesting than seeing all the scratches and blemishes on an object that was actually owned and used by someone. It tells a story. But to answer the question I started this section with, yes, I think Anbernic were absolutely successful in their design. They made good choices and only made changes that made sense. It does feel notably different from the original hardware, but not so much that I would say that's a negative aspect. It really does just feel more like a new release in the Game Boy Advance line, rather than a knockoff or anything like that. Ultimately, I think this is an absolutely great buy. It's one of the best value handhelds I've seen so far. While preference certainly plays a role in whether or not you actually want to buy this for yourself, I think if you see this and think that it looks like something you'd be interested in, it's going to completely blow you out of the water when you actually get your hands on it. $80 for this is, in my opinion, an absolute steal. And if you add the versatility that comes with custom firmwares and a Linux backend to the hardware quality, I don't think you can get much better than this for games that make sense to play in this form factor. And if you're on the fence about picking one up, I can't recommend it enough. But that's it for today's video. I hope you had a good time and maybe you learned something. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in this, and I would love to hear what you plan to play if you plan to pick one up. But other than that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and as always, Happy gaming.